Hi everyone, my name is James Kiemba with my presentation of child labor in India's global supply chain. I'll try to be brief as time is limited, yet I have a lot to present. We have a number of questions. Most of us, we tend to ignore when we go out to buy a pair of sneakers, a shirt, or a bag of rice from the store. So most of the time we fail to ask ourselves, whose labor made this product? International labor regulatory frameworks such as International Labor Organization Convention number 182 and India's domestic child labor laws fail to protect children in global supply chains because they do not really inform and household level production, rely on unenforceable audit systems, and place the cost of compliance on families rather than on corporations and governments whose economic interests depend entirely on cheap labor. Closing this gap requires conditional cash transfer programs, enforceable supply chain disclosures with financial penalties, and targeted investment in secondary school detentions. We shall see all this in our slides to come. That is the argument I'm making today, and the data behind it is hard to ignore. For example, from 2019 to 2020, India recorded 7.4 million child laborers. That number is not a policy failure on paper. It is a failure in practice in every single day. So, okay. Defining the problem. If you want to define the issue at hand, there are three key areas we need to look at. That is the child work, child labor, and hazardous labor. So we can define these three terms for us to understand. Child work is a light, limited activity that does not interfere with schooling. Child labor is harmful to a child's physical, mental, or social development, whereas hazardous labor, defined by the International Labour Organization Convention number 182, includes agriculture, mining, construction, and shipbreaking. Here is the number that exposes the central problem. We can see the figures right there. Factory audits miss 97% of India's child laborers. Because they work in places auditors rarely visit. One of our scholars, Gomez Paredes and others, found that 51% primarily work in agriculture, mining, and fishing industries, and 47% unpaid helpers in household enterprises, and only 3% are regular wage laborers. These 3% are the only ones compliance systems are built to find. So, what is the scale of the crisis? Worldwide, 160 million children are in child labor. India carries the largest burden in Southeast Asia at 5.8 million children, The national secondary school dropout rate is at 16%. For scheduled tribal students, it reaches 24%. Statistics is right there on our screen. Each number represents a child who entered the labor market instead of a classroom. For example, one girl interviewed as part of the Adidas education program in Vietnam told researchers she was skeptical she would actually be paid for studying rather than working. She had been working since the age of 12. Her skepticism was not pessimistic. It was a rational response to how institutions had treated her. So we go to the regulatory framework and its failures. India, as a country, has built a legal framework. For example, the frameworks are there, but I'm going to be selective and choose a few. In 1986, Child Labor Act, the 2009 Right to Education Act, and the 2016 Amendment Act extending protections to children aged 14 to 17 all presents a genuine step forward. All these are on paper. Those laws are protective. In reality, in practice, they consistently fail the children who need them most. For documented gaps explains why. We have 4 documented gaps. We can see here. We can see 4 instances where these regulatory frameworks have failed in India. So, one instance, we see that India is not a signatory to ILO Minimum Age Convention number 138. India's 1986 ban actually lowered child labor wages, increasing household reliance on child labor. There is a researcher I included there to support my claim. Factory audits physically cannot enter household enterprises, where 47% of child laborers work. We saw it earlier on that 47% of child laborers work in household settings. And lastly, the disclosure without penalties lets firms lower supplier prices, worsening child labor outcomes. A law that makes child labor cheaper by suppressing wages is not a protective instrument. It is a policy failure wearing the appearance of the reform. So when we look at the corporate accountability and the audit gap, we have 3 key instances that we need to look at. One scholar, Winstanley, explored those 3 instances: ignorance, indifference, and involvement. So one case leads to another. Ignorance, indifference, and involvement. Most companies start in ignorance. Media pressure moves some into involvement, but involvement takes a different form. The Adidas case in Vietnam shows how thin that involvement can be. Auditors found 12 girls aged 14 and 15 in a supply factory. Adidas funded an education program and paid the girls a basic wage while they studied. A factory manager called their situation in paradise. The girls learned in a room visible to other workers. No long-term follow-up plan existed. Their interests came second to Adidas' reputations. involvement that protects than the child is not a solution. So we look at the economic arguments. Poverty is real. Poverty is real. Families sending children to work are managing an income shortage, not making arbitrary choices. More than 65% of child laborers from bottom 3 income quantities come from the bottom 3 income quintiles, and 44% come from households below India's poverty line. But poverty does not explain the distribution of costs in this system. Corporations generating billions absorb less than 1% of the cost of eliminating child labor. Children absorb 10%, 100%, not 10%, absorb 100% of the developmental cost. Because of time, I will leave that there and learn to our last segment, where we have 3 interventions that data actually support. We looked at this earlier on in our first presentation, where we have 3 interventions in place: conditional cash transfer, enforceable supply chain, and secondary school retention. I will be brief on this because of time. 3, as we've seen, not just free tuition. Our lead scholar, Gomez, estimated these costs to be 935 billion Indian rupees over 13 years, funded by the India and the multinational profiting from its supply chain. I'm going to be selective in what we look at here. The second, as we've seen, enforceable supply chain must carry financial penalties and minimum supply pricing floors. I don't think I have enough time now. Let me just go to the reform path. Is not complicated. The reform path is not complicated. It requires distributing the cost of compliance to the parties who benefit most from the current system. Laws fail because they do not reach where child labor actually occurs, and ask poor families to absorb costs that corporations can cover for less than 1% of production expenses. Until audit systems, cash transfers, and supply pricing standards reach informal production, the majority of working children in India will remain outside the reach of every framework designed to protect them. Thanks, everybody. And that's my presentation today.